Everyday Expertise, and I'm Angela, and I'm here with Peter Chiykowski. He is the award-winning writer, editor, and cartoonist of the print collections the HMS Bad Idea, Postcards from Possible Worlds, and 3 popular webcomics, Rock, Paper, Cynic, Is It Kanan, and What's George Doing Today? He's also written for games, including the tabletop RPG Emberwind and the mobile game Fractor. Welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So how did you start as a writer and cartoonist?
I actually came out of like a creative writing program at Dalhousie University. So I originally wasn't going to do a creative writing program. I was kind of one of those lost, ambling like Bachelor of Arts people. And I took one creative writing course kind of on a lark and just found that I got so into it. And started writing like poetry and short fiction, and like got a couple of publication credits in like Canadian literary journals. And I found that like there's such a specific style you have to write in to do the CanLit journal thing, and I wasn't loving it, but I was liking that I was starting to like find a voice and getting to write for people. And then I kind of started going whole hog into webcomics because I realized that you have a chance to set your own tone, to find your own audience who wants to read exactly what you're writing the way you're writing it, because that's the way that you're presenting it to them. And I found that was like, I don't know, it was just a faster and more it was a faster feedback loop. So with like Canadian literary journals, you like write a story, you spend like a week or 2 weeks on it, you polish it up, you submit it, you wait, sometimes up to a year to hear back. And then it's probably like 98% of the time it's a rejection. So then you do it all over again. And by the time your story comes out, statistically, it's like 10 years later, and you've forgotten like why you wrote it. And you probably hate it by then, because like that cooling off period as an artist is just really brutal when you have to wait that long. And you have time to like realize that you could have done better and all the things you wish you'd done. But with webcomics, I could have an idea and have it out the same day and get feedback from people immediately. I'm like, oh, this part was really funny, or I didn't get this. And so it made for like a really fast education in how to into somebody else's head efficiently. And it was an education in that in a way that like longer form content, you train your skills differently with longer form content. Like you master a certain level of discipline because you have to get it right the first time, and you have to learn how to hold together the entirety of a story and characters in a world in this complex way, and that's its own education. But I feel especially for like someone who turned out to be, I guess, a bit of a humor writer, that quick, sharp, like getting to test a joke on people immediately is so valuable and such a great way to learn how to write better jokes quickly. So that was kind of my in, was pivoting from like literary writing into humor writing for the internet, I guess is kind of the best category for most of what I do.
Yeah. So you've got the three webcomics. Can you maybe just describe each one for us, for someone who might not have seen them yet?
Yeah, of course. So Rock, Paper, Cynic was the first one that I started publishing over 10 years ago now. And it's like, I describe it as like snark and sarcasm. It's a lot of jokes just kind of about what it means to be a nerdy, insecure person in this weird age that we live in. So it's a combination of like jokes about the games and books and movies that I love, but also like what it means to be a socially anxious person, or what it means to be a person who thinks weird things sometimes in public places. So it's very much a mixed bag. Like, it's not quite a diary comic because none of the characters are me, but it's often like what I'm thinking about is what ends up in the comic. So yeah, it's kind of snark and sarcasm. Is It Canon is like all pop culture parody stuff. It's my attempt to like ruin all the books and movies that I love by like asking weird what if questions about them. And that's one that I do with Aaron Link, who's a really talented illustrator. He and I have been friends for a long time. We met through comic conventions. So I write the scripts and he does the artwork. We're probably going to wrap up Is It Canon soon. We've both been enjoying it, but like we both have other projects that we're moving on to, but we're going to probably plan a fun little end run for that. And then What's George Doing Today it's a weird one. It's so you kind of have to see it to get the joke, because if you outright say what's going on, but it's about a fantasy author named George, who has a very long-running, very important book series, very popular book series that he just can't seem to finish, and everyone's waiting for his next book, and we're just keeping you updated on what his daily adventures when he's not writing that next book. Sometimes he's pretending he's a pirate for a day, or sometimes he's doing archery practice, or sometimes he's building a time machine so that he can travel through time and play badminton with himself. So it's just kind of these really silly, wholesome adventures of fantasy author George. And any resemblance to authors living or dead is purely coincidental.
Which is important.
Yeah.
He sees it.
Yeah. It's gone viral a couple times, but I don't. And a couple people have tweeted it at him, but he has yet to respond, and I don't think he will.
All right. Okay, this show's very much about process. So, can you walk me through your process, maybe of, I guess, from idea to finished property?
Yeah, of course. So it's interesting because I work in a bunch of different genres. The first thing I have to do is identify what kind of idea it is, because sometimes a joke idea will come and I'll have to ask myself okay, so A, is it a comic, or is it something that I might try and write? And because I also do comedy music and perform usually at comic conventions, so it's a similar kind of humor to rock paper cynic, snark and sarcasm, and similar to is it canon, because often it's jokes about board games or movies or TV shows. And so the first question is what genre is this supposed to be? Because if it's a quick one-off joke about hashtag relatable humor, or how it feels when you're in this situation, and probably that feeling isn't unique to me. Probably other people have felt it, and there's a way to express what's so weird about the fact that we all feel this, analyzing a weird reaction you wouldn't expect to have, but that is actually really universal. So that's something where okay, that feels like a comic, because it's an idea that you can express in 4 panels, that you can cut off cleanly, and that people can look at it and see something of themselves in it, or they can look at it and see something that really surprises them that isn't about themselves, but that still feels true to them on some level. And that's a good way to work together a punchline. And then sometimes there'll be a joke where I almost want to turn it into a sketch where I can see layers to it, and I can see how you build on it or escalate it. And that's where okay, well, if I can't cram that into 4 panels, or if I lose a lot, maybe that's a song. Maybe that's a 3-verse structure where the first verse is the what's the rhythm for jokes, hop, skip, jump or something. The first verse is establishing this is the ground on which I'm going to build this joke, and then the second verse is hey, look, a joke, and you're kind of building it. And then the third verse is usually just taking the joke to its extremes, and the chorus, at least I never realized how formulaic my songs are, but the chorus is usually just stating the joke in a really obvious, outright way that you can encapsulate in a really good title, and that's how I know, okay, well that joke idea is actually a song. Or sometimes the joke idea will be something that maybe it's funny, but also there's actually a bit of depth to it. And that's something that I'll explore. Okay, that actually might be a little micro story that I can tell through. So the shortest story is something I should probably explain. The shortest story is a micro fiction project I have, or I call it postcard fiction. But basically twice a week, I'll publish a very short story, usually somewhere between 30 and 100, 200 words. And they read kind of postcards that you're sending to yourself from alternate lives that you never lived, or alternate realities that you've never been to. But something about them is usually familiar, because the stories all kind of boil back down to what it means to be human, and insecure, and all those things. So they're very human.
They're really interesting sort of pieces of flash fiction.
Yeah. And they're a lot of fun to write. And so that's the shortest story. And sometimes a joke will come to me and I'll be you know what, there's something about it that feels like there's a speaker behind it, there's a person saying this, and if I can identify that, then usually that means it's actually a story. Because if the narrator is important, then I might not put it into a comic, because my comic it doesn't really have characters; it has these just vessels for jokes. That's
right.
What appears in the comic. But for a shorter story, if there's a strong voice behind it, that's where I like to think, okay, maybe there's a narrator here, maybe there's somebody speaking for a reason, and that's part of the depth of what's there. So step one is identify what format should it be. And then usually for comics anyway, it'll be a matter of converting that into a script. So trying to decide how many beats am I doing, which of those beats deserves its own speech bubble or its own panel. Are there going to be beat panels in between where I want to really draw out this joke? So I'm going to have silent panels that build up to it. And what is the punchline? Because sometimes the punchline is text, it's words, and the punchline is actually a line. And sometimes the punchline is an expression or a reaction to words. So figuring out where does the comic end, what is the joke, and how do you make sure that those rhythms are coming out right? Because it's always like a very convenient thing if you can make it work in 4 panels and each of those panels is a square, because that format works for, every social media platform out there. It minimizes how much work you have to do to actually put the out there. And this is the reason why 90% of webcomics right now is 4 square panels, because it converts to Instagram nicely, it converts to Twitter, to Facebook.
Definitely, yeah.
But that's a function of convenience, and sometimes you don't want to force a comic into that format if it's not meant to be. So I like to explore different formats when it makes sense to do that. And so you kind of work out your script in your panels, and then depending on the comic, if it's something complex or something where I want the panel structure to be interesting, or the what are close shots and what are wide shots to be interesting, or do I do establishing art? That's where I'll sometimes do a little sketch to see does this work out when I actually draw it out? Or even when you're counting panels, sometimes I'll do double wide panels, sometimes I'll do 2 square panels left and right, and trying out what deserves a wide shot or what should be tight. Which panels end up next to each other is also part of the rhythm of how it's read. Whenever there's a jump down, it's more of a big break than if you're just reading across. So I'll kind of play around with that a little bit, and then once I'm happy with that, then I'll go ahead and I draw everything digitally on a Wacom, a very old Wacom drawing tablet. And then it's just I do the blue line sketches, which you don't need to be blue when you're drawing them digitally, but it makes me feel like a real artist when I do it in blue. So I do the coloring, and finally I'll add special effects like shading or highlights or glow effects if there's fire or a lightsaber or something. Yeah. And and then the final version just gets exported for web. And the whole process can take anywhere from for a really quick comic, 2 hours, for a longer, more involved one with a lot of art, 6 to 8 hours. But most of them fall in the 3 hour area.
Are you using Photoshop, or are you using another sort of program, or what?
Yeah, so I draw in Photoshop, although I acknowledge that increasingly there are many better options. I just hate learning how to do new things. And the thought of having to learn Manga Studio or Clip Studio Pro or whatever it's called now, I acknowledge it's probably just a straight up better program for what I do. But I think I'm too much of an old man to change my ways at this point. So I draw in Photoshop. And honestly, Photoshop, it's such it's not made for comics, but it's made for just about anything.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's the second best tool at everything out there, and the best tool at photo editing. So it's nice because I use it for a lot of different things. I prefer it in design for doing just random graphic design stuff. In design, I love for any multi-page project, but if I'm designing a convention handout or a concert poster, I'll do that in Photoshop. Because I know those tools really well, and you can use them for just about anything. So I'm a big Photoshop fan.
So do you have any writing influences?
Yeah, and they differ by genre. So for web comics, the reason I started writing web comics was largely because of Ryan North, who is kind of the godfather of Canadian web comics. Not just because he was really good at producing his own work. With Dinosaur Comics is this fixed format comic. It's I think 6 panels. And every time it's the same 6 panels, same artwork. But the depth of material he gets into, talking about history and philosophy and world politics and all kinds of shenanigans, it's just incredible. And so I think he showed that someone can get into comics even if they're not necessarily an amazing illustrator. If you just have a really interesting idea or an interesting voice, there's a lot you can do with that. And then he also ended up creating a lot of tools for webcomic artists. So RSS Spect was a RSS feed generator for webcomics. There was Project Wonderful, which was an amazing advertising network that was super duper webcomic friendly and very artist and creator driven. And then Oh No Robot, which was a transcription service. So people could transcribe your comics for you, and you can kind of crowdsource transcriptions, and it made them more searchable and more accessible for people reading with visual impairments. So it was just these amazing tools that he just made available for free in most cases. And yeah, so I really liked him as a creator, as a writer, and just as a member of the webcomics community. He just made it seem like a really welcoming space. But then other artists that really got me into it were Kate Beaton and Emily Horn and Joey Camo, who do a Softer World, or who did a Softer World, and they've moved on to other projects, which is a really amazing photo comic and also a big inspiration for the shortest story. Chris Hastings, who did Dr. McNinja, and a lot of these people have moved on to careers in mainstream comics, or have continued to have that growth. So it's just been very cool to follow their career growth. When it comes to fiction, though, I find like I'm overly conscious about taking on another writer's voice if I read too much of their stuff. So I sometimes will try and separate out like people that I like to read or often like listen to, because I'm a big podcast fan. And I'll try and separate that out from like the things that I want to take inspiration from as a writer. Because it's so like the things that I love reading it'd be too easy to like, well, I'll just turn that into the shortest story piece. And like it would be too easy to fall into that. But I've really been enjoying the Magnus Archives, which is a podcast based out of here in London. And it's these like short, creepy, usually like 20 to 30 minute stories that are all like the framework of it is that they're witness statements from this paranormal archive based in London. And it starts out with like this grumpy archivist who clearly like doubts that the statements are true and thinks they're all nonsense. And over time, the more of them he reads, you start to see links between the different stories and some of the events that you're hearing. Even though they all work really well as like one-off short stories, there's like a lot of thread connecting them. And then B, you realize that the archivist is kind of like using skepticism as this desperate defense mechanism against like clearly the encroaching paranormal darkness that's closing in on the Institute. And the Institute itself is clearly like part of whatever weird network of supernatural entities are closing in on Earth. So it's just a really well-written podcast, a lot of fun, interesting characters, and a really good example of like having short game where you write short stories that stand alone individually as like little episodes, but then also you have these larger arcs that hold together the whole story in a really compelling way. And there's so much more that you can like you can have like your conspiracy theories where like you try and connect this episode to this episode. You can have your pinboard of like crazy theories about what might be going on in the background. I love seeing people who have that short game, long game combination. I think it's really hard to do both. I'm very much a short game person. I have a lot of trouble with long game. I can do it. It's a lot more work for me. So yeah, it's cool to see people who can do both at the same time.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So what's something you wish you'd known about writing before you embarked on this journey?
That's an interesting one. I think I wish I'd known sooner that there's more opportunities than you might realize to like create your own space for the kind of work you want to do. I spent a lot of time looking at like, okay, well, here's what gets published in Canadian literary journals, so I guess this is what I have to write. And then when I started webcomics, I was also like, I was anxious about like, well, do I have to sound like these comics to get a readership, or can I just kind of do my own thing, or like, what is my own thing? So I think like anxiety around like what do you write and who's going to read it, and do you have to try and fit in with that? I wish I'd known from the beginning, like just find a creative space that works for you, that like is a good engine for your work or a good ecosystem to support your work, and then just enjoy that and do that, and worry like second about how that's going to find a following. Because I think I was definitely too anxious about like where's the niche where I fit. And I think that's pretty common for like when you're starting out writing. Like there's a lot of anxiety around like who am I as a writer, and what's my voice, and where am I staking my claim. But yeah, I wish I just sort of chilled out a bit and enjoyed like finding my voice and doing my thing, and knowing that like eventually if you do that well, you'll find people who are interested in that thing, because the internet is so big. Like you can find that group now. You know, that wouldn't have been possible 10 or 20 years earlier, where and it's weird to think that I started doing this 10 years ago. Like it's weird to think that a lot has changed in that time, because it doesn't feel like I've been doing it that long. But like if I'd started 10 or 20 years before that, it would have been really hard, I think, to find like a mass of people who read things the way that I would need them to read whatever I wanted to produce. But now like you can find that community, and if you can't find it, maybe you can even build it. And that's really remarkable. That's yeah. And I think I was starting writing on the cusp of like the world changing to that point where you can find those communities. So yeah, I would have needed a little bit of like future sight to be able to give that advice to myself in a credible way.
Yeah. How do you integrate your art into your daily life?
So like right now I work full time, like from home or from like different library workspaces, on like my weird cobbled together life of like original work and freelance. So, I mean, the biggest thing that happens every day is just like learning to pay attention to things that are happening that could be the basis of a piece of writing. So people always ask me, like, or the common question that you get is like, where do your ideas come from? And it is a good question and fair question. It's also a horrendously unfair question. And I think that, I think we all have ideas. I think I've gotten into the habit of paying attention to, like when I'm having a little like daydream wander off moment and I'm wondering like, what if this happened? Like write down, what if that happened? Write down those words. And then if there's a reason that your brain went there, it's some kind of thing of interest. There's some reason it's worth thinking about. So just learning to pay attention to those like idle thoughts that could actually mean something, I think is something that happens to me every day. It's just training that. Because I love like doing brainstorms. I love like sitting down and prompting ideas and giving myself little challenges to work on. But it's really nice having a base to work from, where like you are just kind of taking little like thumbnail paintings, I guess, of what kind of piece that idea can turn into, and just leaving yourself notes for that for later. So that's definitely the everyday thing. But otherwise, like I do a very normal, for the most part, like 9 to 5, or like 9 till midnight sometimes, if it's a real push, like work day. And usually it's like, okay, are there big freelance deadlines that I have to hit first? And those are first priority. And then in whatever time's left over, I'll decide like, okay, do I want to like give myself some more buffer for the short stories? Do I want to get some more comic ideas down? Right now, my comics are on hiatus. I'm taking a bit of a break from them, for like a bunch of reasons I won't get into now. But shortest story is something that I'm still publishing twice a week. So sometimes I'll sit down and just like, now it feels like a good, I have no immediate pressing freelance deadlines. I'm going to like just sit down and play with some images and see what kind of stories come out from looking at those. So I'm going to go through my random on the tube, I wrote this down, story notes and see if there's anything there that's really speaking to me right now. And yeah, so like one thing I find about writing, especially as a daily activity, is yes, there are definitely days where like the muse, and I hate the muse idea, but we're like there are times where just like the juices are flowing and things are working and you get a lot more done in the same amount of time, but like you have to show up to work. That's like the bottom line, is you have to show up to work or you're not going to write. So sometimes just like sitting at the desk and pushing words around, even if it's not going anywhere, is just like part of the gig. And I find I do that more with like when it comes to freelance, I don't have that hold up. Like for the most part, I don't need to sit there and wait. Like there's something where like the professional brain kicks in and I'm like, oh, okay, well, here's how I'm going to handle this particular writing challenge, this brief. And I guess when you don't have a brief, when it's like just a wide open canvas, that's where I can, writer's block, again, which is a myth and not a myth. It's both. That's where that tends to kick in. And that's where, like, again, having those notebooks, having those little idea seeds to work from is really great. Actually, there's a podcast called the Podcomics Webcast. It's a webcomics podcast hosted by David Diamond. Yeah. And one of the sections he always does is, I think he calls it Seeds. Basically, he asks like artists to like open their notebooks and just like read him some like those like 1 to like 5 word notes, or those comic ideas that aren't really comic ideas yet, and like what that would have, what you think that would turn into. And I always find that really fascinating. Like I love seeing those, how other writers leave their notes and how they nurture them into something, or like how sometimes it fails. Like I have ideas that I've had for 10 years that I still want to erase from the notebook because I know there's something there, but like I still haven't cracked what's going to make that work. And I love that. I think it's a lot of fun.
So that's, you would say that's your sort of primary way of coping with block is just basically going back to your notes and seeing if anything sparks?
Yeah. So revisiting notes, I think, is a big one, because sometimes you'll just that piece you were missing before is something that you didn't notice that you picked up, the key to unlock it. And so going back to old work helps a lot for that. I feel like, I experience this more as a writer than as a cartoonist, where like, okay, I want to do a short story and I just literally have no ideas to begin with. Or sometimes I have an idea, but like, how do you start this story? And I think there's like a technique that I used when I was doing short fiction that was like, I don't want to call them long short stories, but not the shortest stories, not micro, like regular length short stories in the thousands of words. Was just like write a really bad first sentence and just do it, like rip that Band-Aid off, because part of, I think, I think there's this like internalized logic for writers where you think if I write a bad sentence, I'm a bad writer. That's how it works. If I write the bad sentence, that makes me the bad writer. And therefore, like if I start this story off with a bad sentence, that means I'm a bad writer for this story. I know that that's something that I recognized as a totally ludicrous thing that I was probably in the back of my head thinking. So I got in the habit of just like right off the bat, just like write a really bad first sentence just to get it done, because then like you've broken that ice, you've like that's happened. There's nothing to salvage now. You have nothing to prove, and now from here like you can just let it flow and then go back and craft your precious perfect line later. But if you let the precious perfect line hold you up at the beginning, you're never going to get into the story. And also the thing that I always find is like by the time you're 1,000, 2,000 words in, you're starting to discover what the story's about. You knew sort of, you had an idea, but you discover what the story's about, and then that first line may not make sense anymore. And there are I can't remember if this is a metaphor that I'm stealing from somewhere. I'm pretty sure it's from Janet Burroway's on writing or writing fiction. But there are like when you're building a house, sometimes there are load-bearing walls that are designed as part of how you build the house, but they're not part of the final floor plan. So they're there for construction, and then you knock them out. Or like scaffolding. There's building you do so that you can do building. And with writing, I think you have to learn to recognize like what those lines are, what those sections are. Where like this is how I discovered who the character was, but this scene isn't actually going to be part of when I'm done taking down all the scaffolding. That's not going to be there anymore. And that's what I think, like just letting yourself do a bad first line and just start the story so that you can find out what the story's about, and then you can go back and deal with it is important. Because I think we spend too much time like trying to get things perfect up front, and that's you can do that. It's not a wrong thing to do. I just find that it usually doesn't end up serving the story in the long term.
Okay. So what is your favorite aspect of writing?
I think my favorite stories or my favorite like moments in writing are when I have an idea that shouldn't work. Like I don't think it should work, but I think I can make it work. And it's not quite forcing it, because that's not the right like. I'm trying to think of a good example to articulate this, but like I love it when I have an idea that's like just on the cusp of like that shouldn't happen, but I know how I can nudge it into the territory of like, oh, that feels credible. Actually, I can do an example of this. So there's a story that I posted last week for the shortest story called Newcomers, and it's about like a demon who comes up through a spirit board, is summoned through a spirit board, and like immediately like promises like, hey guys, I'm going to be cool, I'm going to behave, this is going to be fine. I don't want to go back to hell, and like they always, if you stick around too long up here, they send you down, and I don't want to draw attention to myself, so I'm just going to like chill out here for a bit, and I'll go back when I go back. Is that cool with you guys? And the narrators are like, yeah, I guess we can try that. And over time, like the demon who comes up to get that other demon looks around and realizes like, oh, it is kind of nice up here. And it turns into this like whole very domestic community of demons. I think that I got the idea from like a Reddit. There's like a Reddit community subreddit, our writing prompts. But like what I wanted to do is like, can you make like this like domestic demon thing work? Is there a way that I can make like a domestic demon story that feels really right? It feels not just natural, but like inevitable. I guess that's what I was trying to say before. I like that the task of writing to make something very unnatural or improbable feel inevitable. Those are my favorite stories, because it really is the way that you challenge people's expectations the most, you challenge your own skill the most. And I think that when you manage to do that, your writing becomes part of the wiring of people's heads. It's now part of, there's a link there that they didn't have before that changes how they think. And I think that's a really like powerful thing to be able to do as a writer. And it's one of like the privileges of writing is like, I think we all have writers who, the way that they, I don't know, described the smell of apples in like that's just how you smell apples now. You have connections you didn't have. And getting to like forge those moments is really important. And to me, my favorite arena for that is, again, those stories that shouldn't work, but by the end it feels inevitable that that's the way things go.
That's interesting. So a least favorite aspect of writing, something that frustrates you?
Like scenes that are just kind of part of the machinery of like the plot. And usually if you're doing these, not always, but sometimes it's a sign that like, okay, the scene could be doing more work. But every now and then there's just like a bit where like, this is just necessary for establishing something, or it's not there's less elegance to it, and it's more like a machinery in the plot. And I find I get bored with those scenes pretty quickly. But again, usually if that's happening, it's a sign that like maybe you can be doing, this scene can be doing more, these characters can be doing more. But every now and then, like especially when you write stories where there's stuff going on in the background, or like there's not necessarily a twist, but like there's been something hidden that's finally being revealed. Sometimes like you just have to make the revelation really clear, and sometimes the clarity of that matters more than the art. Otherwise, people won't be able to appreciate the story. And so like those bits where you're just like, here's what happened, are my least favorite. But again, if I find that I'm getting into one of those scenes, usually it's a chance to like, okay, maybe I can try and make this do a bit more. Maybe I can make the scene a bit more ambitious than it was going to be.
Right.
The challenge is always like, if you go too ambitious and it's a section that like really clarity is the reason that the scene exists, is to like give the reader information that will help them understand or appreciate the rest of the story. You don't want to go too artsy or too artful. You don't want to risk like losing people there. So it's hard. Like it's always a hard line to balance.
All right. So I think we've gotten a lot already, but do you have any more advice for people starting out in writing?
Like definitely don't be afraid to make mistakes. Like I think if you could sit there for 2 hours and try and struggle for like the best idea ever and not get it and not produce anything, it would just be better if you wrote a bad story. So write a bad story. Like that's just it's good exercise. I would say work in short formats rather than long formats when you're starting out. Is like if you can anyway. I don't ever want to like suggest like don't be that kind of writer, be this kind of writer. That's anyone who's doing that is giving you bad advice. What I'll say is if you work on your like 18-part fantasy epic now, that's going to require that many novels, like you're going to be a different writer by the end, and you're going to have learned so many things that you wish you could have applied to book one. But because the work sections you set for yourself are so big, it'll just be really hard to complete like one really good thing and polish it and to have learned from it. So definitely like have your amazing 18-part fantasy epic novel, but like practice some short stories. Just like practice getting how to make your characters more human and likable, because then when you start your 18 volume epic, you'll have characters who people want to stick around with much more. And yet that first novel, which is the way that you get people into your story, into your world, and is part of making that whole thing better and having it do what you want it to do as a series. That character will be someone that people want to spend time with. So they're going to be into that world. You're not going to have to go back and do like revisions and revisions and revisions, because, you know, you could have learned through short stories that like characters that are just a placeholder for you aren't necessarily going to charm people the way you think they might, which is, you know, a common mistake young writers make. So getting to learn how to make your mistakes and do better in a shorter format is just going to teach you a lot more. So like, don't change the kind of writer you are, but like learn how to practice. It's kind of like you know, start off with like short jogs before you work on a marathon if you're training up for that, because you'll have a chance to like learn things. So you'll get your fundamentals in. Yeah, that's one thing that I'd say. Yeah, definitely don't be afraid to make mistakes. Feel free to like feel the anxiety of influence and like do a story in the style of this writer, and do a bunch of those in short formats, and you'll learn over time like where your actual voice is. Because I found that like I would go through like a heavy doing comics like Randall Munroe phase, and then I go through a heavy doing comics like Emily Horn and Joey Comeau phase, and I do a prolonged Penny Arcade phase. And I wish I had just like, rather than like going on binges of artists and like this section of my work clearly sounds too much like this, I wish I had like jumped between them and experimented more and been like leaned into the influences more consciously, and then learned to triangulate myself in the space between those writers and creators. Or like, how do I do a piece that's all of these people, or that reflects like the little bits that I like about all of them. Like I think like Ryan North is a really boisterous writer, and I think that boisterousness comes across in my work. And Randall Munroe does a lot of stuff with like meta narrative that comes up in my work, and Emily Horn and Joey Comeau do a lot of like demonology and blood sacrifice, but making that seem really funny and absurd. And that's something that I love doing in my work. So like learning to piece those, like, because you're going to start off again like being an imitator. That's how a lot of writers start out. So learning to like imitate in a way that you find yourself in, I think is important. And I wish I had like done that process in a more thoughtful way. Yeah, I guess those are some pieces of advice that I would pass on.
Okay, cool. So I think we're basically at the point where how can people find out more about you?
Yeah, so I'm all over the internet. I'm in too many places. Most of like the hub for most of it is probably honestly my Twitter account. I am at Rock Paper Cynic on Twitter, and rockpapercynic.com is currently on hiatus, but you can link to a lot of my projects from there. And yeah, the thing that I'm most actively updating is the shortest story at shorteststory.com, and it has its own social media stuff too. But yeah, like my Twitter is where everything ends up eventually, and I'm pretty communicative on it. And then shorteststory.com is where you'll see the most like content updating right now. But I'm hoping to have to have my comics up and running again fairly soon. But the timeline on that one is imprecise for now.
All right, cool. All right, well, thank you, Peter. Thank you for speaking with us. Thank you, everybody, for watching. This has been Everyday Expertise. I'm Angela. Bye.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this interview. Be sure to share this video with friends and colleagues who may also enjoy this topic. Let us know your thoughts by leaving a comment below, or check the description for our social media. See you next time.